Welcome to the Economic and Political History Podcast, where we discuss the latest ideas on the intersection of economics, political science, and history. Hi, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Economic and Political History Podcast. I'm your host, Javier Mejia from Stanford University. And today I have the great pleasure of being with Volha Charnysh. She's a Forward Career Development Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science at MIT. And she's the author of a book that just came out, published by Cambridge University Press, that is called Uprooted, How Post-World War II Population Transfers Remade Europe. And you could see Volha showing one of the printed volumes. A very nice cover, by the way. Volha, how are you?
Good, thanks. Thanks for having me, Javier. I'm really excited to talk about my book. It's taken a while to write it and to publish it, and so it's fun to think of where we go from there.
To see it out. I know. When you were visiting Stanford a few months ago, and you told me about the latest stages of preparing the manuscript. So I was very, very happy of seeing it out. And I was even happier of reading it and being aware of all the things that I didn't know and that I learned. So I'm very glad that you had the willingness to chat with us about it. But before getting into the book, I wanna hear more about your life. I want you to share with us how you became the scholar that you are today, interested in historical political economy in Eastern Europe. What's the path, and how do you think you got interested in this historical perspective to migrations and the area of study that you focus on?
Great. So I am from Grodno, Belarus, and it's a town that was actually affected by the very history I'm writing about in my book. It experienced massive population redistribution after World War II. It is a town that was a part of the Russian Empire, a part of the Polish state, a part of, even earlier, it was a part of the Lithuanian, Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and before that, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. And so I am from a place that has a lot of interesting history, that experienced a lot of border changes and a lot of population movements. And so, interestingly enough, my hometown on the eve of World War II was 42% Polish and 40% Jewish. And today it is predominantly Belarusian. And so that history has always been in the back of my mind as I was growing up, even though I knew very little about the actual historical events that happened. And it inspired me to dig deeper into this. But only, after quite some time of studying completely unrelated topics. I came to the US first as an exchange student, and I studied in a small high school, actually in a huge high school, Glasgow High School in Bayard, Delaware, and that just made me really interested in coming back to the US to study. And so I then came here for college. And eventually started a PhD program at Harvard University. And so my initial research interest was actually nuclear proliferation. This is what I studied in my undergrad. This was my first job out of undergrad at the Arms Control Association in Washington, D.C. And so it was also inspired by history, because Belarus, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan were three countries to relinquish their nuclear weapons after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. But it was quite different things that I was interested in back in the day. And so only after coming to Harvard and taking some coursework, also teaching for Grzegorz Eckert, a professor of comparative politics who works on Central and Eastern Europe, did I learn more about the history of my region and how it might be, relevant for bigger issues in political science, the issues of migration, state building, economic development. And I also really wanted to draw on my um, language skills in the region. So growing up, I was watching a lot of Polish TV, listening a lot of Polish radio, which allowed me to pick up Polish, even though I never formally studied it. So my native languages are Russian and Belarusian. And so I also studied German in high school in Belarus in addition to English. And so basically, when I was in grad school, I became interested in comparative politics as opposed to the bigger issues of nuclear proliferation that I was studying before. And I realized that my language skills and will allow me to, delve into the issue from perhaps different perspective than many other people working on this region. And this is when, combined with the history of my hometown, it all kind of came together and led me to learn more about World War II and population transfers that took place
Let me ask
town
you.
and elsewhere.
Let me ask you something else about your path, and I'm curious. I had forgotten that you had this pre-academic experience on policy organizations, and I'm gonna ask you later about how you perceive your career as a scholar and what do you think that we're contributing to the world. But I'm curious about how you've experienced the increasing interest for Eastern Europe, right, with the events in Ukraine recently. Um, I have the impression that now we're all expected to know something about it. How have you experienced that, right? Are you happy with that growing interest? Do you find it annoying that now suddenly there are all these experts that maybe don't even speak the languages of the region? Tell me about that.
Yeah, so it's been fun kind of seeing how work on Eastern Europe has evolved. So when I was in grad school, uh, a lot of interest was still kind of in this like transition from communist to from socialism to market economy, democratization in the region, variation in democratization paths between states like Poland, Czechoslovakia, or later Czech Republic and Slovakia, and Hungary and Romania, and states like Belarus, the Central Asian republics, and so on. So it was a very different type of research. And for me, having grown up in the 90s in Belarus, I found it quite uninspiring just for my personal interests. It seemed much less interesting to me. And I am glad that research on the region has been, in many ways, vital and invigorated by many new developments in the region. Now, a lot of these developments are pretty tragic, like Russian invasion in Ukraine. There was also massive protests in Belarus in 2020 that got a lot of people writing about Belarus. The annexation of Crimea in 2015. So all of these events were certainly, really traumatic for the population in the region. But I am glad they kind of read interest in the region in ways that were unrelated to its communist past, and that new questions are being asked about these countries. Also, that there are a little bit more opportunity to hear more about this country's own visions of themselves. So when I was studying nuclear proliferation, it was a lot about like general security with this Russia as a successor to the Soviet Union, and kind of like the main country of interest in the whole process. And so smaller countries, smaller post-Soviet countries, did not appear to hold as much value for scholars and policymakers. They were seen through this lens of Russia and its nuclear arsenal and Russia's interest in the region. And I think that now, especially with the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, there's a little bit more opportunity for scholars from these countries, and scholars who study these specific countries to have a little bit more voice in the scholarship and in the discipline. So I see it as a positive development. Certainly in the beginning, there's this moment where everybody writes about things that are happening, and some of those people are very informed, and some of those people are not. I've been trying to restrain myself from doing too much on these specific topics because I believe my expertise lies elsewhere. But overall, I see it as a positive for the field, and I also hope it generates more interest for students to study languages in Eastern Europe and to obtain expertise. So hopefully, this expertise will accumulate over time.
Let me take you then into your field of expertise, right? And the episodes you explore in the book are very concrete, are the population transfers during World War II, right? So why don't you give us a context of what these were, and yeah, give us some tools to understand these episodes. Like, where was this happening? How many people are we talking about? How do they resemble other population transfers in recent history? Tell us a bit about that, please.
Yeah, great. So I will also just say that even though I'm from the region, until I really started studying this in grad school, I had very vague idea of what actually happened, because often when they talk about World War II, this is not the events that are at the front, and like this are not the events that we are really talking about. So everyone probably has a sense that World War II was fought to some extent over race and ethnicity, and World War II already involved multiple border changes in the process of the war. So Nazi Germany invaded Czechoslovakia, invaded Poland, and it redrew this country's borders in the course of the war. So German borders have expanded, and new borders were established within these countries. And Nazi Germany was carrying out genocide against Jews and Roma. It displaced Poles in order to make space for ethnic Germans who were brought into these territories that Germany annexed from Poland. At the same time, as the war started, the Soviet Union moved from the east and annexed Poland's eastern borderlands on the pretext of protecting its Ukrainian and Belarusian blood brothers. And so the Soviet Union also, in the course of the war, conducted mass deportations of ethnic groups from the regions annexed from other parts of the Soviet Union. So Crimean Tatars, Chechens, Poles, Russian Germans were all affected. And so as the war was going on and all of this violence and forced migration were taking place, the Allied powers that were working to defeat Germany and were by then joined by the Soviet Union after a German attack on the Soviet Union in 1941, began talking about how to deal with the region once the war ends and once they saw they would win the war. And so it seemed making some more border adjustments is going to be a good idea and reasonable. And these adjustments, followed by adjustments of population, seemed to be justified and seemed as a solution to peace and stability in post-war Europe. And so already in 1943, at the Tehran Conference, the USSR, the United States, and Britain were talking about what shape post-war borders would take. And Joseph Stalin in particular was arguing about keeping the territory that Soviet Union initially annexed from Poland when Soviet Union was in alliance with Germany in 1939. And so this annexation was justified by the presence of large Ukrainian, Lithuanian, and Belarusian population in Poland's eastern regions. And basically, even though at the time of the conference this area was controlled by Germany, Stalin was really trying to make a case that this area really belonged to the Soviet Union and to the new Soviet republics that would be established there. And so the Western Allies initially resisted this idea of revisions at the cost of Poland, which was a victim of the war. And they really needed Stalin's help. And so they wound up agreeing to some of this because the solution was then to annex some territory from Germany to compensate Poland for the territorial losses in the east. And in this way, it was seen as, one wrong will be corrected by another possibly misguided policy. And so the annexation of German territory was justified in a number of respects. Germany was seen as an aggressor in the war, and the goal was to also to weaken Prussian militarism, because a lot of territories that would be annexed were part of Prussia. And weakening Germany was seen as a good thing, preventing German aggression in the future. So basically, these discussions culminated in formal border changes at the end of the war. And the easiest way to describe how borders changed is to think about Poland and to imagine independent Poland from the interwar period. And to imagine that Polish borders were just shifted 200 kilometers to the west. And so Winston Churchill talked about this, and he used this quote, like a company of soldiers, 2 steps left close. And so this happened, what this border shift entailed was the annexation of Poland's eastern borderlands to the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union was already pretty much there because the front has been moving west as Germany was losing. And then compensating Poland with German territory along the new border established along the Oder-Neisse rivers. And so this meant that Poland received a bunch of territory that used to be historically German, had a German population, and so on. There were also some other small border changes. For example, the northernmost part of Germany's East Prussia was annexed to the Soviet Union. This is an area where Königsberg, German city, became Kaliningrad, this enclave. And there were some other adjustments of German territory in the West unrelated to the movement of Polish borders. And so the discussion of the borders has taken a long time and involved many considerations and bargaining between the allies. But then moving people was the next step, which was seen as natural and was not perhaps deliberated in as much detail as the border shift itself. And so it was justified in a number of ways, but at the time there was a widespread belief that ethnic minorities were a source of political instability. This was, of course, partly because of this view that people have primordial attachments to the ethnic group that cannot change. And so Germans were viewed as a fifth column. This was also exacerbated by the fact that Germany used mistreatment of Germans as a pretext for invading Poland and Czechoslovakia. And it was believed also that when states become ethnically homogeneous, they will be more stable, and so creation of this ethnic homogeneity will be a safeguard against future conflict in Europe. And so the policymakers were also acting with a view of past historical precedents. So the previous big transfer was the Greco-Turkish population exchange in 1923 under the Treaty of Lausanne. And so this was this technocratic approach combined with primordialist conviction about the immutability of ethnic attachments that led to this decision. And so again, Winston Churchill, who always produces these great quotes, he basically said in 1944 that there will be no mixture of populations to cause endless trouble, as in Alsace-Lorraine, used that example. He further said, a clean sweep will be made. I am not alarmed at the prospect of the disentanglement of population, nor am I alarmed by these large transferences, which are more possible than they were before through modern conditions. So it seemed to be no big deal to move these people, and it was justified in a way that suggested there would be peace and stability in Europe if these people would be moved. And so we're talking about huge numbers of people here. Nearly 20 million people were uprooted from their homes. At least 2 million died in the process. And some of these uprooting, even though it was supposed to be orderly and humane. And the conditions of the Potsdam Conference was far from that. A lot of people were violently pushed through the borders, especially Germans, in the aftermath of this brutal war. And so, in terms of numbers, at least 12.5 million ethnic Germans were relocated. And for Poles, at least 5 million Polish citizens, although for Poland, only 2 million of those were from the territories that were annexed in the east by the Soviet Union, and the rest included voluntary migrants from other parts of Poland, also people coming from forced labor in Germany. And of course, there were also other smaller groups uprooted, including Ukrainians and other populations.
And in practical terms, how did this operate? So people would be taking on trains and then just dropped at a specific place, and did they receive plots of land, houses, the houses of the people that left? Like if you were one of these migrants, how would your experience have looked like?
So that's a great question. So it really varied over time. So, when we think about Germans in particular, the first waves were fleeing and fleeing the Red Army. And closely afterwards, there was a wave of wild expulsions where they were just pushed over the border by the Polish and Czech populations, for example. And so a lot of people just wound up on the crossing the German border and kind of stuck there, trying to figure out where to go. And over time, the transfers became more orderly, and so they proceeded predominantly by train. And so people were loaded on the train, assigned to specific occupation zones in Germany, and then within those occupation zones, the authorities would take them into camps, delouse, record, and then allocate them to specific German states and to specific counties. And within these counties, the local authorities would figure out where to allocate Germans with respect to specific settlements. And a lot of their logic was to allocate people to places where there would be housing. And so the idea was to send German expellees, the name that became popular in West Germany after a while. So to send these people to the countryside where they would be housed in together with the native population. So they wouldn't be placed in camps, although some of them wound up in camps anyway. But the goal was to put them in these places with some housing and in this way distribute them across the territory in a way to make sure everybody got accommodated. Now, it was, in reality, it was a very messy process. And it was not quite as it was intended. And so in case of Poland, a lot of people, basically the people were moving into the area from which Germans were still leaving. And it was often the case that they would arrive and they were supposed to take over German houses and farms. And so they would often arrive and the family would still be there. So there would be a brief period in which they would share this house. And again, population coming from the territories annexed to the Soviet Union was traveling predominantly by train. And again, a very messy process where they would, the trip that today probably would take less than 8 hours would take sometimes many days and even months in the post-war conditions where trains would be rerouted and the president would be given military transport. A lot of the time people basically had no idea of where exactly they would be going. And so if they were coming from these annexed territories, they could take some property with them, in contrast to Germans who were often leaving empty-handed or just with some basics in their backpack. And so they could take some property with them. They were in the train, and the train would take a while to arrive in the Western Poland that was annexed from Germany after the war. And then when they would arrive there, they would again be kind of allocated to specific areas based on availability of housing. The authorities were trying to keep sending people to new places which still needed to be kind of populated. They were looking at population density. They had very poor information about this. They had no maps of the German territory. And at the same time as this forced migrants from territories lost to the Soviet Union were traveling, people from central Poland were also encouraged to move. They often would get free train tickets, and they were supposed to also kind of go there, take over German property, settle in. And of course, a lot of people who were forced laborers in Germany or even in this territory that used to be German, they were staying there, and they were also taking over this property. So it was kind of a big disorderly process. But the difference in the Polish territories was that all of the native population was being expelled, and their property was taken over by migrants from different. And so I would say in just a very small proportion of pre-war inhabitants remained in this area, concentrated in Silesia and some parts of East Prussia, and the vast majority of the population was just arriving, taking over this area, and today they're all like second and third generation migrants, which is different from the German case where expelled Germans were arriving into pre-existing communities, and they, basically the native population remained, and expellees were added in pretty large shares to the local population all across East and West Germany.
I want to ask you about the research process, because one of the things that is super interesting about your book is that it's full of the historical details that you just described, but also it's pretty intense and rigorous with quantitative evidence, right? So how did you approach to this question, right? Where did you find the evidence? You go to archives? I know you did, but I want to hear about that. Let us know how was just knowing about this thing that you have heard, but was so well but sparsely recorded.
So I started working on Poland, and so actually my dissertation at Harvard University was just about the development of this area that Poland received from Germany, and focused on the information about where migrants came from in this region, and how communities that were settled by more and less homogeneous migrant population performed over time in terms of their state capacity and economic development. And so this was my first question of interest, and I basically read a bunch of books by Polish historians, and I got a sense that I might find some historical data. This was in a time when historical political economy was still on the rise, but there was this interest in quantitative research. There was this discussion of identification strategy, and so what attracted me to the question was in part that I felt that some census of these people might have been done out there. Those numbers might be available somewhere in the archive, and the process was so haphazard that where migrants wound up, and in particular how diverse the migrant population would be uncorrelated with pre-existing social and economic conditions in this community, which is, often a big problem when we try to understand the causal effects of migration and migrant diversity in other contexts. And so knowing that, I basically began searching in Polish archives, and I worked a lot in Archiwum Akt Nowych in Warsaw. And, I wound up basically locating the 1948 census of all municipalities in this formerly German region by, again, consulting some historical books which didn't publish any, the full results from the census, but they did reference it, and by kind of digging through archival materials myself. And I would say, back in the day, the biggest challenge was just taking this information and turning it into a data set. Because this was a poor quality microfiche, and I essentially wound up like taking photos of it with my camera. It was before the iPhone times, and they were all of pretty bad quality, but there was no way of like actually scanning them as you could probably do today in many archives. And so I wound up just entering all this data by hand because I was a grad student and I didn't have many resources, and also the quality was just so poor. So working, I would say finding the data was just like a small battle. It gave me encouragement about feasibility of the project, but then really creating data set out of it was a lot of work. My family in Belarus helped a little bit because just like typing all this by myself of poor quality, was really hard on my eyes and my neck. And, my father, who just like, who was a lawyer, but he kind of helped me enter some of it because he felt bad for me. Like today I would do this completely differently. And of course I would hire someone to help, and presumably the scans would be much higher quality. But back in the day, like entering every single, data point was a ton of work, and the quality was really bad. And then I had to deal with like administrative border changes because municipalities that were there in the 1940s are very different from municipalities that are there today. And so I ended up looking for maps of those municipalities and then figuring out how to digitize and georeference them. And again, I don't know, maybe today they're already available in digital form elsewhere, but at the time it was all kind of like a learning curve to figure out. And then of course the issue was, now that I have this great data on migration, I need some indicators about pre-war levels of development, because we might worry that migrants are sorting into places that are more economically well off or have better farmland or whatever that is, and that could influence subsequent state building and developmental outcomes. And so I wound up on a search for German census data, and I actually found the 1939 census. But I found it's in a Polish archive, right? So these were also, again, this like pretty poor quality records, and they were used by Polish authorities to kind of get a sense of this territory. And so then the issue was looking at the change in place names, because all the German municipalities, they had different borders, and also they had quite different names from these Polish municipalities, even just a few years later. And so in that sense, dealing with some of the online sources, genealogy sources that talk about that census and map the historic German name to contemporary Polish name really helped. And the final challenge was, as I was working through the dissertation, was dealing with the communist period. And so, I was trying to find good indicators from after 1948, and data from communist period not always available. Also, we might not trust some of these indicators, and just the number of different things that could be measured is a lot smaller. For example, the natural thing to look would be electoral outcomes, and elections in Poland were not free and fair until the 90s. And so looking at things like turnout would not be very useful, and vote choice is perhaps even less useful, and so on. So those were like the big challenges of doing historical research, which I think are still there for scholars working on these topics, but maybe somewhat mitigated by improvement in technology, by the process of getting all this data, by archives themselves digitizing some of the records. Again, I don't know about the specific records that I worked with, but I increasingly see like a lot of historical data digitized. And so when I was working on West Germany, which was much later in the process, and when I was already a faculty member, I had more resources, and also West Germany was perhaps better organized at publishing some of this data. And so the challenges were very different. So basically, some of the data I used for Germany already came from, it's the same period, but this is a census book that was actually published. And so I just had to scan it in and digitize it. And some of the stuff was also already available, made available by other scholars, especially at the county level in Germany. There has been some work already. And so, for example, Sebastian Braun had a website where I benefited from using some of his data and so on. So the challenge in Germany was more like dealing with the difference. Germany had federal structure, and different German states had different um, data availability, published books in different ways, and getting them was sometimes a challenge. And so, and of course, the number of administrative units in Germany was much larger. So, in Poland, this area that I was studying had just like over 1,200 municipalities in 1948, which is not that much if you think about Bavaria, just one German state that I studied in detail, where in 1939 there were over 7,000 municipalities, and then those became just 2,000, just over 2,000 in later periods. And so, like, merging these units over time was challenging. And again, historical maps were not always available at the municipal level, even though for counties they already very much existed at every level of analysis. And I will just mention the final issue is like that I was facing when doing this work is I'm dealing with events that took place a long time ago, but I'm studying people and the interactions with each other and with the state. And so, it was quite challenging because I couldn't interview these people directly, and I had to rely on some of the records like memoirs, diaries, or also work that other people have done before me. In Germany in particular, there were scholars already studying the consequences of this migration. In Poland as well, but in Poland this was during the communist period, and so there's a question of, how whether you could take some of these interviews at face value and what you can trust. The same with memoirs written during the communist period. But basically digging up some of this data, making it all fit together, was quite a big undertaking and a big part of this project. And at each step, you always wonder, like, will I be able to get enough evidence to test my hypothesis? And you never know until data collection is finished. Exactly.
It's a beautiful account, the one you do on what the work of historians is, right? At least the type of historians that we are, right? That we need quantitative data. We want certain type of results, and we're never sure if things are going to work. And let me just say that I can totally relate with your description of how the productivity in the field has just exploded in this generation. So I think we were probably the last generation that saw the previous era, right? Where you had to go to the archive and take like tiny pictures and then transcribe that by hand. And I'm very glad that the times have changed, but at the same time, it's hard to communicate how challenging it was to have some of the results that we were able to gather back in the day. So it's great. So hopefully the younger generation appreciate our work more, knowing all of that. Let me get into the argument of the book, because your book is interesting not only because of the historical reflection and again all this careful research on the context, but it also provides this very interesting set of regularities that feed into big, challenging theoretical questions, right? About the role of migration and even further diversity on state stability, state capacity, and even economic development, right? So let's talk about that. And the way in which I understood your argument is this one that has sort of three pieces that are somewhat interconnected. And I want to hear how you frame it, right? But I would say, so the first thing you argue is that this sort of forced migration programs indeed reduce social cohesion, right? There were these new people coming and some of the social tissue of the local communities was eroded. And that's the first part. And I want to hear, I guess, briefly about how you find that, what is the logic and mechanisms of that, and then how you connect that with state capacity and how that with economic development, which are, I guess, the most controversial, and also because of that interesting parts of your argument.
Yeah, great. So yeah, you're right. The argument has three different parts, and I think that's, because I'm just looking at the consequences of displacement and population mixing that resulted from it over a pretty long time frame, and I believe that's actually an important part of the book because, there's this. Basically, my takeaway is that the consequences of migration in the short run might be very different even in direction than consequences of migration in the medium and long term. And so, my argument has three parts, and I'll start with the first one. Basically, I argue that forced migration can create new boundaries that are very similar to ethnic boundaries in ethnically divided societies. So even when people share ethnicity, nationality, religion, and so on, we might see that just simply rearranging them in space can create new cleavages, increase social tensions, and undermine cooperation for the provision of public goods. And so, this argument seems counterintuitive in light of how the Allies thought about the population transfers, because they were actually thinking that gathering Germans into Germany, Poles into Poland, will just increase cooperation and lead to political stability. And so their decisions were again grounded in this like primordialist understanding of ethnicity. So if you share ethnic identity, then you probably are deeply attached to it, and it doesn't matter if you're German from Sudetenland or German from Schleswig-Holstein. You must find common language, and you're just coming home to Germany anyway. And so actually this turned out to be not the case in practice. And so my argument explains a little bit how this happens. So, I argue that forced migration can create new cleavages through two different processes. So one process is simply intergroup interaction and physical proximity of people that before were nowhere near each other. So interaction and proximity accentuate differences between people who lived in different places. And so suddenly, if people might have been similar to us when we saw them from afar, when they actually arrive in our hometown, we notice all of these differences, and we notice that they are strangers and they do not fit in. But perhaps more important than this, just simply variation in cultural characteristics across space, is the fact that displacement in and of itself and settling in a new location can produce new boundaries because of this very experience. And so when we think about the uprooted population, they have lived through some violence, they lost their assets, they might now have a sense of common fate, and they have real common interests in obtaining resources in this new place where they're strangers. So this binds them together, creates a joint shared identity as a forced migrant, but it also separates them from other people, from voluntary migrants, from the native population in the place where they arrive, and so on. So, this very experience, even if they really saw themselves as the same as the locals before migration, creates this new boundary. From the perspective of the native population, the process is pretty similar. So suddenly you get a bunch of newcomers, and you have competition for local resources, for jobs, for housing, for land. In the case of Germany, you literally had people put in your home, and you had to live with them for a while, share a kitchen, which is creates some tensions. So when you suddenly get this inflow of population into your area, you also have a need to close ranks and to protect access to resources that you have. And so this has been noted in other cases. For example, the Sons of Soil conflict, studied by Jim Fearon and David Layton. But there were always this assumption that different ethnicities are a part of the mechanism. And so what I'm saying is that we do not need to have ethnic differences for this to occur. The very process of displacement and arrival of individuals into a new community where they interact with others can create these boundaries. These boundaries particularly likely to harden in conditions of scarcity, because group identity becomes this marker of who gets what. So that's the process that these boundaries can can later lead to the under-provision of public goods and weaken cooperation at the local level.
So let's talk about that. So that's the first element. So this forced migration processes, even if they are characterized by homogeneity in the final setting or arrangement of population, could lead to additional cleavages within society, right? The second element is about how that connects with the provision of public goods and state capacity, right? And for that, you explored this idea of societal barriers, right? So tell us about that second element of your argument.
Yes, exactly. So, precisely by creating these new societal divisions and undermining cooperation for the provision of local public goods in the communities, forced displacement also increases the demand for state presence and weakens resistance to state intervention. So the two parts are connected, right? You have to, have this weakening of cooperation through migration. And that the next step is that what are the implications for state building once that occurs? And so, to understand this part of the argument, it's just important to remember that generally the expansion of state authority generates resistance from different societal actors. So, state control can mean greater taxation, loss of autonomy. States might redistribute wealth, and so there will be powerful elite interests that are disadvantaged by this. And so when we have forced migration and mixing, which creates this kind of weakens community's ability to self-organize, this could be actually good for state building, right? So there are, again, several related mechanisms that get us there. So when communities have weaker social ties, greater internal conflict, are less successful at providing for themselves, then they have more to gain from state provision. They have greater demand for state-provided public goods, and this basically reduces their increases their interest in state presence. At the same time, again, because they're so much weaker at self-organizing, they cannot resist state extraction and state control as effectively as communities that did not experience displacement, or where everybody is, where there are no group boundaries, essentially, where the population is tight-knit and homogeneous. And so, and the final kind of related mechanism is when we just talk about people who were uprooted as opposed to the communities that were affected by the inflow of this uprooted population. Individuals who are uprooted from their original communities and who lost their belongings and wound up in this new place where they're strangers, they also have fewer outside options, and they're more likely to turn to the state or other formal organizations for credit, for insurance, for welfare, for various forms of support. So their demand for state presence increases. And so the takeaway of this part of the argument is that forced displacement and new cleavages that result from this forced displacement creates an opening for strengthening the state. And so then this could lead to the accumulation capacity, provided the state does invest resources in these communities. And the more resources that are invested, the stronger the ties that will develop between these communities, and especially the displaced population and the state.
Okay, so that's the second element, very well integrated with the first one. More cleavages in the longer term, a higher demand for state capacity. What's the third one? How does this connect with economic outcomes in the very long term?
So, and the final part of my argument is basically that forced migration can lead to superior economic outcomes. And this is especially likely in the long term, where this initial social tensions are overcome, and also when forced migrants are able to, find jobs and get back on their feet. And so there are two mechanisms that could lead to this beneficial economic outcomes. And the first one is the one that I've already talked about, the reach of the state institutions, greater state capacity, and increased supply of centrally provided public goods. And so, research in political science and economics has already shown that having greater state capacity, in particular the provision of so-called market-supporting public goods, can increase returns to productive economic activity, lower the cost of economic exchange. This is, particularly likely in states that have inclusive formal institutions. This is, again, an argument made by Acemoglu and Robinson. So this greater reach of state institutions, greater state capacity, can be beneficial for economic development down the road. And the second mechanism is the diversity of skills and perspectives that migrants bring with themselves. So when we have the arrival of migrants from other parts of the country or other countries, they might be different from the native population in some respects. And so this could lead to greater innovation and productivity. Also, mixing of migrants from different places of origin is particularly good for this diversity of skills and perspectives that migrants bring. So this insight actually draws again on research that's already out there, particularly in economics, and that has shown that migrant diversity can lead to greater entrepreneurship, maximize economic productivity, and innovation. And relatedly, also more diverse populations, whether created through forced or through voluntary migrations, will have different weaker social ties and fewer strong social ties. And so this can affect how ideas travel, how relationships are formed, and again can lead to greater productivity and innovation. So, to sum up, the combination of increased state capacity and the greater diversity of skills and knowledge in places that experienced in migration, particularly in migration from a variety of different places of origin, can improve long-run economic performance when we talk about things like entrepreneurship, innovation, and so on.
I want to ask you now, and we're approaching the end of our conversation, something that it's probably somewhat unfair, and it's this always annoying question on external validity. It's not really about external validity, but it's about how you think your results as useful to think about the challenges that Europe is facing today, right? And we began our conversation precisely on this theme, right? How the attention of the world has been conducted towards Eastern Europe. What do you think that the evidence you show, the logic of your argument could be used to think about the crisis that Europe faces today?
So indeed, when I was writing the book, this crisis were very much in my mind. And so I guess the biggest takeaway that under the right conditions, hosting forced migrants can benefit the host society, particularly in the long run, I believe would apply. Now, I should be careful here in that I'm dealing with, very particular case of forced migration in history. And the biggest difference here is that the population that were uprooted enjoyed full citizenship rights in the states where they arrived. And so when we think about migration today, particularly the arrival of forced migrants in Europe, including from the Middle East and from Ukraine, these individuals do not automatically get citizenship rights, which has some implications for the generalizability of my argument, right? So when I talk about the demand for state presence, we can imagine that refugees who cannot vote or who could be seen as temporary presence in their new societies, these people have greater barriers for making claims on the state, and the state might be less likely to invest in these populations because, again, it sees them as temporary. Also, a lot of the time, refugees are excluded from participation in the formal labor market, which affects their ability to sustain themselves and to contribute to the local economy. And so To the extent that some of the current refugees are limited in that regard, this could absolutely affect the generalizability of some of the positive consequences of forced migration from my book. But I will still say that there's a lot of relevance from the general logic of the argument to current refugee cases. And so one question that I think could be is this importance of cultural similarity, right? So one of the key concerns about refugees in today's Europe is the impact on culture and way of life there. And so we saw this striking difference in the treatment of Syrian and Ukrainian refugees in particular. Even though Ukrainian refugees were far more numerous, they received much better reception. They received more rights in their new places of residence. And so what my book would say, what I would say in light of my experience in studying these historical cases, is that the preoccupation with refugees' culture is misguided. And the real issue is actually economic competition, which is affected by state policy and might be dependent on resource scarcity rather than actual cultural distance between different population groups. And so, basically, a big difference is that governments just treat refugees from different places differently. And this, again, we can see this with respect to Syrians and Ukrainians. And this different treatment discourages integration by the group that is treated more harshly. It's stereotypes among the native population. And so such disparate treatment of individuals based on their ethnicity or country of origin has downstream consequences for this population's interactions with the state, with implications for their participation in the local economy, and for the ultimate way in which they can contribute to host societies, and for their incentives to integrate, right? And so, my argument basically also says that when we think about what kind of migrants, forced or voluntary, we might want, right? The answer is not necessarily we want people who will be most culturally similar to the native population, but actually that it's good to have a diverse migrant population. So the more places of origin, the merrier, as opposed to migrants from one particular region. And I find this in my book when I study the diversity of German refugees, the diversity of Polish population in this new territory, and so on. And this is, again, the reason for this is that people who have lived in different environments, were educated in different school systems, they can just, really work in different ways, and they can have more positive consequences for productivity and innovation in host societies down the road. And so the second implication of my argument for Europe, which I already have hinted at, is that, we can think of what policies ensure that refugees can integrate and contribute to the economy. And so, it's basically not excluding this population from the formal employment sector, giving them incentives to assimilate and study language, study local language, because when they are able to work and they're able to also allocating them in ways that encourage interactions with the native population. And so when states do treat forced migrants in this way and invest resources in supporting them and allow them to participate in the local economy, then this tends to pay off in the long run, not only in terms of state capacity necessarily, but also in particular in economic performance in receiving communities.
Thanks a lot. I really like the way in which you make so visible how this careful historical research is useful for the most relevant questions in the political agenda in Europe today. That's great, and I indeed agree that your book does a great job giving tools for addressing these issues. Let me ask you one final question. I guess continuing on this theme of how your work can be useful, but also connecting with our initial conversation, and it's about your role, I guess, beyond academia. And you're a good person to talk about this because you don't only write interesting academic books, but also, well, you're part of this super interesting project that it's Broad Street, a blog that, by the way, if you listener are not aware of it, it's a great place to find interesting, approachable research on historical political economy. So you're part of the team that coordinates and selects what people can read there, but also you have exposure on media outlets. I know you are interested in cartoons in a very tangible way. So my question is pretty general, but it's about how you think that your ideas are relevant beyond just writing articles and books. So do you think about that when you do this other stuff? Or are they just part of your hobbies? Or how do you approach this type of things?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say, like, one challenge that I see with being an academic these days, especially, I have no comparison. I've only been an academic in these days, but still, we're basically training to become experts in this very narrow fields, and we acquire very specialized expertise. And we end up writing for a very narrow audience of other scholars, and the way in which we write focuses on things that, might seem completely irrelevant from the bigger policy questions of the day, and might bore a reader who is not trained in this academic language and statistics. And so doing things outside academia has been really helpful for me to kind of not lose track of other things, of things that I found interesting when I decided to pursue this job in the first place. Not to forget what drew me to these topics that I study, and not to kind of lose my mind in the midst of cleaning data sets and worrying about causal identification and doing all these robustness checks that we have to do. And so doing things like Broad Street, for example, has been great because, it kind of allowed me to, first of all, express my own ideas in a more accessible way, and also just to get a broader range of learning what other scholars in other disciplines, including, again, I read a lot of history books, but for Broad Street, we can get historians writing for non-academic audience, the same for economists writing for Broad Street. So, working with Broad Street allowed me to just kind of be exposed to a broader array of research that I normally wouldn't have time to read if it was in the form of this 100-page papers, traverse disciplinary boundaries more easily, and also to just kind of practice in thinking about bigger questions that might be of broader interest, even if they're not necessarily, causally identified. And so this was, I would say, really good for my brain, for my creativity, and so on. I've also seen it's very gratifying to have, to write something that doesn't take 5 years or it just feels good to have something appear on a page. And with respect to cartoons, I've been initially trying to integrate it more with my knowledge of politics. I was doing more political cartooning, and then I started with drawing on nuclear proliferation, heavy topics like that, or Belarusian politics, and then eventually, I would say, during COVID times, I've moved toward less political topics just to keep it light, because it was important to find humor in daily life, and because my job is already so encompassing that on top of it, adding this constraint of also being funny and witty while doing it was just a little bit too much. And so, I really enjoy doing it as a kind of a break from my job in my spare time.
That's great. That's a great way of finishing this conversation, Volya. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for taking the time. This was very fun. And it's always nice to see you. I hope that many people can also have the opportunity to read your book. And I hope to see you in person again.
Thank you so much, Javier. This has been fun discussing the book that it's thankfully done and written, and I hope it will also be really fun for the readers, both inside and outside academia, to actually take a look at the book.
Totally. Bye bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in today to the Economic and Political History Podcast. Don't forget to stay connected with us on YouTube and Spotify. I'm your host, Javier Mejia from Stanford University. Feel free to follow me on Twitter at Javier Mejia C and connect with me on LinkedIn. You can find me as Javier Mejia Cubillos. Until next time, stay engaged, thank you, and take care.